Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to today's lunch lecture, which is on a very topical issue, immigration. Our speaker today is Dr. Elena Fiddian-Qasmiyeh of the Department of Geography. Elena is a reader in human geography and the co-director of the Migration Research Unit. You can find her CV on UCL webpage. I would just like to highlight the two major research projects on Syrian immigrants, which she's leading at the moment. One is called The Local Community Experiences of and Responses to Displacement from Syria, which is funded under the Global Challenges Research Fund. And the second one, South-South Humanitarian Responses to Displacement from Syria, Views from Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, funded by the European Research Council. Her two most recent monographs are also on Syrian immigrants, one published by Routledge in 2015, South-South Educational Migration, Humanitarianism and Development, Views from Cuba, North Africa, and the Middle East. And one published in 2014, The Ideal Refugees, Gender, Islam, and the Sahrawi Politics of Survival. The Twitter feed for the Lunch Hour Lectures is at UCL LLHL, and the event code today is 7176. At the end of her presentation, we are going to be taking questions from the audience and also from our virtual audience. Now with Elena.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for that very warm introduction. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Today I'll be speaking about the role of established refugees in responding to the Syrian refugee crisis. But in order to do that, I'll just preliminarily start by setting out, obviously, some of the figures that you're all familiar with, which is the state of displacement in the world today. Which currently we have over 65 million displaced people around the world, of whom 21.3 million, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, are refugees. That's to say, are outside of their country of origin and have crossed an international border, while almost 41 million people remain internally displaced within their countries of origin. Within those figures, Syrian refugees are the largest refugee community, with over or almost 4.8 million people having been displaced from Syria, and the majority of those refugees remaining within neighbouring countries in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey, which are the three countries where most of my research is continuing to take place at the moment. But what's also very important to recognise is that the contemporary displacement scenario is also characterised by different processes of hypervisibility and of invisibility, that we focus in particular in the media, in political discourse, in civil society activities on particular groups of displaced people, whilst others potentially are rendered invisible. So, for example, over 6.7 million Syrians remain internally displaced within Syria, and yet the majority of focus is on the refugees who have crossed that international border and have become an international problem rather than a national one, as it were. The processes of hypervisibility and invisibility are also prevalent within the focus on the different forms of humanitarian actors who respond to the situations of refugees, with a great deal of attention focusing on the responses led by the United Nations, by international non-governmental organisations, European, Western civil society movements, etc. And yet there are also very significant responses being developed on local levels, and that's really the focus of my work at the moment. As indicated earlier, one key project looking at the roles of local communities as responders to displacement from Syria, and focusing on those three neighbouring countries that I've just referred to. And this is a project which is just starting now. It started in September and will be taking place over the next 4 years. And we'll be examining the roles of 9 local communities, 3 in Lebanon, 3 in Jordan, 3 in Turkey, in providing different forms of support and response to refugees. And those local communities are often, of course, composed of citizens, of the citizens of Lebanon, the citizens of Jordan, the citizens of Turkey. And yet there are also key roles being played by established refugees. And this is one of the key areas that I've been focusing on in the past few years, what I call refugee-refugee humanitarianism. The recognition that refugees do not simply experience displacement and wait passively for assistance to be provided to them, but rather themselves provide and act in different ways and provide support to other members of their own community and different groups of refugees with whom they share different kinds of spaces and places. So a focus on refugee-refugee humanitarianism, I think, is very important in terms of challenging those assumptions of passivity, of the assumption that refugees will wait for assistance to be provided for them, and rather recognise the agency of refugees in highly complex situations. But I think it's also very important because it taps into three key trends within the displacement scenarios that we find around the world today. The first key displacement trend is that displacement is increasingly protracted. That's to say that an average refugee situation is estimated to last over 26 years. And these are some figures from the United Nations in terms of 11 refugee situations having lasted over 30 years at the present time. Between 20 and 29 years is the duration for 12 refugee situations around the world. And that's the average duration that people will be living in displacement in that context. Protracted displacement is then accompanied by urban displacement. Refugees living in displacement typically do not reside in refugee camps. Over 60% of refugees around the world reside in cities and towns. So we have a duration, we have a temporal dimension, we also have a spatial dimension. People are living for longer periods of time in cities and in towns in displacement situations. And these two first trends have been extensively examined, and yet the implications of that for the overlapping displacement, which is what I refer to in this context, the overlapping displacement experienced by refugees who live alongside not only the citizen hosts in those contexts, but also other refugee groups which have been displaced to the similar cities and towns to themselves. And these implications of overlapping displacement have not yet been analysed in great depth, and that's what I'm particularly interested in exploring. And if we think about some of the figures which we know exist, Turkey is host to refugees from 35 different countries of origin. Lebanon is host to refugees from over 17 countries of origin, etc. And you can see some of the figures there. There are multiple groups of refugees being hosted in the cities and towns of these cities across the global south. And this leads me to the focus of today's presentation, which is the roles that established refugees in the context of Lebanon have been playing in providing support and hosting new refugees arriving from Syria. And what I'll be doing is I'll be reflecting on the roles that have been played by established refugees in Badawi refugee camp in North Lebanon. This is a Palestinian refugee camp which was established in 1955. As you can see, it is an urban refugee camp. It is incredibly cramped. It is home to approximately 25 to 40,000 established refugees whose grandparents arrived in 1955 and whose families have been brought up in this particular camp context. And the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon are typically known as islands of insecurity. That is a term used by Rosemary Sayeh to reflect the fact that there is no overarching authority within the camp, but rather the camps are run by competing groups of factions and militias. It's a highly complex, violent space. And yet this is also the space of sanctuary, the space of safety that refugees from Syria have often arrived in. And it's this tension between the camp as a cramped, dangerous space, and yet also a space which has become home to refugees, which I'm interested in exploring in more detail. So Badawi camp is now home to established Palestinian refugees, but it's also now home to Syrian nationals who have been displaced by the Syrian conflict, and those more invisible groups of refugees who have been affected by the conflict in Syria, which include groups of refugees who had previously sought safety in Syria, in Damascus and in the other cities across that country, and who have now found themselves experiencing a second or a third or a fourth wave of displacement by virtue of this ongoing Syrian conflict. So Badawi camp is now home to Syrian refugees, but also Palestinian refugees from Syria, Iraqi refugees from Syria, Kurdish refugees from Syria, etc. So there's a highly diverse group of refugees living within this established refugee camp in North Lebanon. And just as it's important to recognise the diversity of the refugees who have arrived, it's also important to recognise the diversity of the refugees who are now hosting refugees displaced by the ongoing Syrian conflict. And we can use the example of the 2007 destruction of the refugee camp of Nahr al-Barid, also in North Lebanon, to illustrate the complexity of these overlapping processes of displacement. So approximately 15,000 Palestinian refugees were displaced from Nahr al-Barid in Lebanon in 2007. And approximately 15,000 of those actually moved to Badawi refugee camp. So Badawi camp became home to what we can consider internally displaced refugees from Nahr al-Barid. And approximately 10,000 of those refugees continue to live in Badawi refugee camp because Nahr al-Barid remains a raised camp. It effectively has been razed to the ground, and there have been very, very few efforts in actually reconstructing the camp. So people remain hosted in Badawi refugee camp, but in turn they have become part of the host community, welcoming and providing assistance to newly displaced groups from the Syrian conflict. So these are internally displaced refugees hosting refugees who have previously been displaced to Syria. So we have multiple ways of displacement, of being hosted and becoming the host, of offering assistance, receiving assistance, and negotiating the complex relationships that exist in these processes. So in Badawi we see that a multiplicity of support mechanisms and assistance processes have been taking place, including sharing the delivery assistance spaces. So this is a delivery centre, as it were, sharing medical centres, sharing the schools which have been established for established Palestinians in this particular refugee camp context. We also have both a sharing of space but also a changing of space in this highly cramped environment. So when the first groups of refugees started to arrive in 2011, people opened their homes and shared their accommodation with new arrivals. And yet over time, new processes have taken place in which new construction work has been undertaken. And this is a photograph from a trip I completed last summer to Badawi camp, where you can see a new building being constructed, or a new set of floors being constructed upon the original foundation ground level of this particular building, which is going to be rented out for new refugees from Syria to inhabit. This obviously also has implications for the local economy in terms of the booming business industry by virtue of these new construction projects taking place to accommodate new refugees. But it's also a potential source of tension. And for example, the family from whose balcony I took this photograph were gravely concerned about the insecurity of this building, which has been constructed upon very weak foundations of its own. So the potential for this actually to collapse and be a risk for different groups of refugees in that environment. So we have both a sharing of space but also a changing of space. And the changing of space is primarily taking place vertically because of the cramped nature of the camp. So you can see the proximity of the buildings. You can literally stretch out your arm from one balcony or from one window and touch your neighbour's window or your neighbour's balcony in that process. So the sharing of space is very complex in this particular context, but there are also horizontal changes taking place within the alleyways of the camps. And here we see, again, a particular small kiosk, a falafel kiosk, which has been established by a Syrian refugee in Badawi camp. And these little kiosks are then being transformed into little shops in the camp. And again, transforming the local economy in different ways. And also, at some points, not simply providing new services, such as establishing a new falafel kiosk, but also replacing the jobs which had previously been occupied by established Palestinian refugees. So these bargain shops, the $1 shop that you can see here, currently being run by a Syrian refugee, had previously been run by a Palestinian refugee. So there are different changes taking place in the camp, and so many changes and so many shops popping up, etc., that this street has been renamed Syria Street within Badawi refugee camp. So there are ongoing changes taking place by virtue of this relationality, the sharing of the space and the changing of the space in these contexts. There are also more intimate changes taking place, as it were. So this is a family who was renting a small room on the lower level of this building, and they have extended a virtual threshold to be able to hang their clothes out, occupying what had formerly been the public space and transforming it into their own little opportunity for hanging out their clothes to dry. And here you can start to see some of the tensions that also arise when drawing upon or drawing into the public space, which is the proximity that might exist with electricity lines and electricity cables. So here we have clothing lines and electricity cables side by side in parallel, reflecting the entangled lives that these different refugee groups are experiencing in this camp, and also the potential danger that exists on a daily basis. So unfortunately, there are regular explosions that take place because the electricity is completely overcharged, and also instances of electrocution when wet clothes accidentally touch the electricity lines in this context. As a reflection of how rapidly this change is taking place, this is a photograph from the summer last year of July, August, and if you can just see this spot here, which I'm highlighting with the mouse, this is the kind of the electricity junction. By the time that I returned in March, April, you can see how rapidly the electricity cables have been separated out to be able to provide electricity to greater numbers of people within this context. And this leads to greater insecurity on many different levels. So there is an entanglement of lives, there is a sharing of space, there is a changing of space, but there's also a question of the capacity which people have and the capacity that the infrastructure has to actually provide assistance and support in a sustainable manner to these newly displaced refugees, who are themselves actually now protracted refugees. If they've been in displacement since 2011, how new are they in terms of actually being newly displaced, etc. So in essence, what we find is that these camps have been offering assistance, and they do help us understand the complexities of refugees providing assistance, of using their agency to assist other refugees, to respond not only to their own situation, but also those of others, but also the extent to which different challenges might arise in these contexts of sharing. So one of the concepts that I draw upon in my work is the concept of hostility, which is a concept used by Derrida to explore the tensions that exist between hospitality and hostility, and the extent to which, when you welcome a guest, the possibility of expelling that guest is always there, because by virtue of inviting somebody in and welcoming somebody, there is always the possibility of rejecting them. And that is a tension that is constantly present in many of our encounters with and observations of refugee situations around the world. And this is also a situation that is prevalent in this particular refugee camp context as elsewhere. Focusing on the assistance provided by refugees is not to idealize that, but rather to recognize that agency in the context of extreme and precarious challenges, of the violence, of the exclusion, of the marginalization which is experienced by people across these different processes. So the camp is both a space of solidarity, of providing assistance to other members of the refugee nation, as it were, and many refugees arriving from Syria had precisely identified Badawi camp as their destination point, because they wanted to avoid the difficulties and the restrictions which have been developed by the Lebanese authorities towards Syrian refugees, and they preferred to actually go to this particular insecure, violent refugee camp rather than face the particular restrictions faced by or developed by the authorities. So it's both a space of solidarity, but it's also a space in which different hierarchies have been developing. And when we talk with, or when I've been talking with Palestinian refugees who've been born and brought up in Badawi refugee camp, they talk about a hierarchy of refuginess, of the new refugees becoming the refugees who are identified by external observers as requiring and deserving assistance, while they become part of the backdrop, as it were. Their presence, their protracted presence, has precisely led to their being invisible in many regards. So assistance is being prioritized for new Syrian refugees and refugees from Syria through international and national organizational responses, through civil society campaigns, and even opportunities for resettlement to third countries. But at the same time, there are processes of exclusion and marginalization taking place insofar as the assistance available to established refugees is increasingly under pressure and increasingly rendered insecure for different reasons. So Palestinian refugees who have been living in these camps for a long time have been receiving service provision from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, whereas UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, has more recently entered the camp and has started providing different forms of programs and support mechanisms for refugees from Syria. This has led to what a lot of my informants have referred to as the UNHCRization of the camp. So the camp is becoming a UNHCR space rather than an UNRWA space. And this is problematic on many different levels, including the mobility of professionals, of people who had been working for UNRWA Palestinian educated refugees who had been working as teachers, as doctors, as program leaders, etc. for UNRWA, moving over to UNHCR, which is seen as a more international and more prestigious organisation to work for. So there is a loss of support mechanisms and a loss of service provision for the established refugees in this process. And this has led to some tensions within the different refugee communities. And when the prospect of potentially being resettled to Europe or to North American countries arises for new refugees who have arrived 2, 3, 4 years ago, protracted refugees who have been in these camps since 1955 ask, well, why would one prioritise the newly displaced over those of us who have been losing our lives effectively in these camps for such a long time? So why is there this hierarchy and this visibilisation, hypervisibilisation of the new refugees to the detriment of the established populations? So there's this tension between solidarity, providing and sharing with newly displaced people, but also that tension with the hierarchies that take place between the different organisations operating in this shared space, the hierarchies that exist between different refugee groups who want to be in solidarity in many instances, but also feel that they're being overtaken and overshadowed in that process. So that's one point by means of semi-conclusion. Another point is precisely to question that sustainability of refugee-to-refugee humanitarianism, precisely in context with overlapping displacement and protracted precariousness. So yes, we must recognise the agency of refugees. We must transcend that depiction of refugees as passive victims waiting for assistance to be provided by outsiders. We have to recognise the ways in which people survive, and not just survive, but lead, as far as they can, meaningful lives in very, very difficult situations. So we must do that. But we must not do that at the detriment of actually recognising the ongoing needs and rights of those people who are living in protracted displacement. And that's where the sustainability of refugee-refugee humanitarianism is particularly complex. So how can one actually provide assistance, programmes, etc., which can support both newly displaced refugees but also established refugees, rather than reproducing forms of exclusion and marginalisation in those contexts? And that just returns us to those tropes, to those ideas of hypervisibility and invisibility. Who do we focus on when we are thinking about refugees? What is the figure that comes to mind? And who is actually rendered or left in the shadows and the margins when we think about our responses to refugees and the forms of support that we might want to offer to them and for them? So I'd like to just thank you very much there and just conclude. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. So now we can open for questions. Okay.
Thank you very much for your very powerful presentation and lecture. It's obviously very emotive what you're showing us. I'm speaking from the point of view of a teaching and education point of view. I'm not a QTS teacher, but I used to teach English as a foreign language or English for speakers of other languages as a world language for everyone. I'd be interested in your opinion on what role we in the United Kingdom and Great Britain have to provide English language provision for migrants. There was a project, for example, in Dunkirk that I was trying to get involved in and I couldn't in the end, for those who are in Calais at the moment. I mean, UCL is a global university, but I think being able to speak a language such as English or other world languages for communication will be of massive import in providing assistance to those who are here. And you have obviously the knowledge to say whether that's something we can do or whether it's not of use in our current situation.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So part of my work as the coordinator of Refuge in a Moving World, which is an interdisciplinary research network bringing together students and staff from across all of the different departments and faculties of UCL, has been to start thinking through how we can connect up the different responses that we develop in academic life, but also in our political and our practical engagement with refugees. And alongside colleagues from the Development Planning Unit, from the Institute of Education, from the Centre of Languages and International Education, etc., we have been putting together a series of proposals and initiatives helping to coordinate the different activities taking place across UCL and helping, I think, develop a stronger institutional response from UCL, precisely drawing on our expertise from such a wide range of faculties and departments, and precisely how one could provide support for asylum seekers and refugees within the United Kingdom through foundation programs, through the development of a migration support unit within UCL, for example, are some of the points that we've been exploring and discussing with Vice Provost Professor Anthony Smith, for example, and very much talking with colleagues from across UCL at different levels to see how those different forms of support could be developed. Certainly, there are many different initiatives of providing assistance in the different displacement camps across Europe, and also in the refugee camps and in the cities across the Middle East, and of course further afield, because I don't want to reproduce those processes of invisibilization by only focusing on Syrian refugees, when we know that there are displaced populations, both internally and internationally, around the world, across sub-Saharan Africa, Central and East Asia, Latin America, etc., amongst others. So there are many different opportunities for providing support for refugees, and absolutely, for many refugees, saving a way of life is as important, if not more important in some instances, as saving a life. So the focus on the provision of food and shelter is of course very important, but people want to develop, people want to maintain their way of living, and part of that way of living is continuing to learn, continuing to explore, continuing to act in their own right. And precisely how we can support that through different ventures is something that we're exploring in more detail. So thank you. Please get involved as well. Thank you.
I actually sort of have two questions, but I hope I can squeeze them in. One was if you could say a little bit more about your method in the camp in terms of the type of research you're doing, like sort of how do you find your informants, what are the networks of communication, how do you get people to talk about things? And then the other question I had was just the more, within this situation of refugee assistance and the layering of historical refugees, how much of the race element plays in with, for example, refugees from Mali, or the question of contemporary refugees in invisible crises, so the Iraqi, Afghanistan refugees versus Syrians, that kind of discussion and how you think about it in a sort of global. It's a lot of questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So challenging questions, especially the second one is very challenging. In terms of my methodology, my research as a whole is typically multi-sited and ethnographic in foundations, and attempts to draw upon in-depth interviews with as wide a range of people as possible in different contexts. So for the research project that I was referring to, the 4-year research project on local community experiences, this is going to be based on multi-sited research across 9 communities, in which we will be working with 9 local researchers whose research trajectories have been directly affected by conflict and by displacement, so either refugees themselves whose research trajectory has been interrupted, or host member communities, members of host communities who have also been affected by the arrival of new refugees and would like to explore those processes in more detail. So working very closely with those 9 local researchers through the provision of ongoing research development opportunities for them as integral members of the team, rather than as field workers who go out, collect the data, hand it over to me, and then I go off and do my analysis and I publish my pieces under my name, etc. But actually working collaboratively is very important in my mind in these contexts, and precisely providing an opportunity to build and strengthen regional research capacity is very important. This is quite an ambitious project. I'm leading it with 3 other colleagues in the UK, and we will hopefully be conducting about 510 interviews with refugees, and also with refugee hosts and with citizen hosts. So exploring the relationship between refugees who receive assistance from local community members and local community members' responses themselves and perceptions themselves. And we'll also be conducting research with local level aid providers and national level aid providers and international actors such as UNHCR, given that the international community is increasingly interested in localized responses, but also increasingly concerned around the potential modes of exclusion that might take place in those contexts. So the methodology is attempting to be quite rigorous, multi-sited, but also very much grounded within participatory research And we're also using creative writing workshops as an opportunity to try and transcend the humanitarian narrative of the refugee as a victim, and rather allowing refugees, or providing a space for refugees, to express their own concerns, dreams, aspirations, concerns, etc., in a more productive space, and having a variety of literary readings, etc., in addition to the academic outputs. The second question relating to the role of race and religion, I think, is also very important here. So one of my research, one of my PhD students has been exploring the roles of, or the experiences of religious minority refugees from Syria, and the extent to which they have been providing or receiving assistance from different community groups. And we're certainly very interested in exploring those processes of inclusion and exclusion on the basis of sexuality, religious identity, ethnicity, whether Iraqi, Kurdish refugees, etc., are receiving more or less assistance, or opportunities to receive assistance and to provide it as Palestinian and Syrian refugees, for example. So it's a very complex context, and the methodology obviously also reflects that. So the extent to which we are able to access or gain access to religious minority refugees will in part depend on how we enter the site, who our particular gatekeepers are, etc. It's a highly complicated situation, and very different across the different 9 research sites, which will include large cities, but also relatively small refugee camp contexts like this in urban environments. So I hope that broadly answers your questions. Thank you.
We have a question here.
I think my question is going to reflect my almost complete ignorance of this topic, so bear with me. What role is played in the situation where there is a stable political leadership? For example, there is a government in Iraq to support their nationals who are in camps in other places, or perhaps even to encourage them to come back to their native country, or what at least might have been their native country at one point. So, and I guess the other one I might think of is the political leadership of the Kurds in northern Iraq. I think that summarized the question.
Thank you very much. So the possibilities of repatriation, of returning to the country of origin, is something that is actively explored, certainly by international organisations, but also explored by refugees themselves. So refugees, even though we had the figure of 26 years as the average displacement period, that is for a given refugee situation. It doesn't mean that a specific refugee will be in constant exile for 26 years. They may be, but they might also experiment and see if conditions are sufficiently secure in their country of origin to be able to return. So relatively frequently, people will actually return to their country of origin, or their parents' or their grandparents' country of origin, if they're able to do so, and establish the extent to which that would be a safe and secure experience for them to return. And that is one of the potential opportunities, but also one of the challenges of returning to Iraq, for example. So refugees from Iraq who had sought safety in Damascus, for example, and have subsequently been displaced to Lebanon or Jordan, might not wish to return to Iraq because the reasons why they fled to begin with might be ongoing in terms of different forms of persecution of particular social groups, in particular religious and ethnic groups, etc. So there may be ongoing tensions, and there may also be problems in terms of the repatriation support that might be available. So it certainly is something that individuals, families, collectives, and also the international organisations attempt to promote in different ways. But it's also very problematic and on a case-by-case basis in many regards. It's also certainly the case that many Syrian refugees and Kurds from Syria have been hosted and welcomed in the independent Kurdish areas of Iraq, and also in other areas. But again, the extent to which that is safe and secure is problematic, and the extent to which that is an environment where people can live safe and secure lives with the ongoing waves of violence and displacement which are taking place from Iraq renders that a difficult solution on a durable front, as it were. So these are processes which are constantly in flux, and the violence that is being experienced in Iraq means that it's quite difficult to return to Iraq if that is a context that one might have wanted to return to. So, thank you.
Okay, one question here, then we go to the audience.
Oh, yeah. Hi. I'll be holding a talk myself on migration. and I'm trying to establish some things which are facts. And one of them had to do with repatriation. And my impression with Syria, from what I can find, is there's very little to go back to, even if the violence were to end. And I just wanted your opinion on that. And it had to do with the water level, that there's no water left. And they can dig wells now 400 meters deep, and they still can't find water. And is this your impression too?
Thank you. So certainly there are many academics who would argue that one of the key factors underpinning the conflict in Syria is a conflict over water scarcity, and that this has been a long-standing issue in the Syrian context. So indeed, what one can return to in not only a context of mass destruction, as has been experienced and is continuing to be experienced in Syria, but also in which scarcity of resources mean that staying alive would be very problematic, makes return and repatriation exceptionally problematic and very fraught. So the international community again has a variety of projects available to be able to redevelop and reconstruct, but that has to be in appropriate conditions. And one of the key tensions in terms of repatriation is when international states and international organizations believe and assert that it is safe for people to return home, which may be the home that an individual left, but it might be the home of parents or grandparents, which has never actually been inhabited by that person themselves. So the extent to which that repatriation is actually voluntary or forced. And there are many examples around the world of involuntary repatriation being promoted because it's in the international community's best interest rather than an individual, family or communal best interests on those levels. So unfortunately we will certainly continue to face the difficulties of ongoing waves of displacement from Syria, but also the ongoing displacement within Syria, and the likelihood of a durable solution being very problematic for several years to come, unfortunately. Thank you.
I think we have a question there.
Thank you. This is a question from slido.com. The code is 7176. The question is, do you think, therefore, that the recent protracted nature of refugee status, I assume they mean the 26 years, therefore diminished hospitality compared to the past?
Thank you. I think that the relationship between hospitality and hostility has been a long-standing one, and there have been numerous studies, for example, in the 1980s, exploring the relationship between Eritrean refugees in eastern Sudan and the ways in which local communities provided assistance, in part due to similar ethnic and religious connections, intermarriage, etc. But after a certain number of months or years, tensions may begin to arise. So I'm not convinced that it's inevitable that tensions should arise, but rather that very careful programs and policies need to be developed which do not re-marginalize hosts. And that's one of the reasons why our research project is focusing on community-level experiences and responses from both perspectives, from the perspective of refugees, but also the perspective of hosts. And the international community increasingly recognizes the need to go beyond paying lip service to providing development solutions to refugee and local communities, rather than humanitarian solutions, which are often quite short-term in duration, but also in vision, and really providing mechanisms to support communities who are hosting large numbers of refugees, and ensuring that that is a sustainable mechanism which does not drain resources and goodwill in that process. So I think there is an opportunity to think more creatively about these questions, and hopefully our research project will help us move towards some policy recommendations in that direction as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, but we are running out of time. There's going to be a lecture here at 1. I have a question myself, but I'm going to ask you later, and I'm sure you will take more questions afterwards. Thank you very much, and thank you, Elena, for the very interesting lecture.